Hello people, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we talk about 10 countries with insane histories that you've never heard of. We've all heard of the American Civil War and the French Revolution. The Cold War and Cuba are old hat by now, and we've seen so much on Iraq and Afghanistan we know them inside out. These parts of history may indeed be pretty crazy, but they're so well known they just don't have the same impact anymore. But do you know about the world's craziest Central Asian dictators, who spend millions building marble palaces or boil their political opponents to death, depending on which country you look at? Do you even know which countries are in Central Asia? Many of you may not, and that's what makes finding out about this stuff so interesting, horrific as some of it undoubtedly is. No one is Paraguay. If there was ever to be an all-important rule for leading a country, it would be to not declare war on countries 20 times the size of yours. Leaders who fall foul on this generally end up in a pretty bad state, and one of these was Paraguay's dictator, Francisco Solano Lopez. At the time, Paraguay hadn't been a country for very long, but Lopez seemed determined to end its existence before it even started by declaring war on Uruguay, Argentina, and, incredibly, Brazil in 1864. As one might expect, this didn't go too well, and only half a century after independence, 2/3 of the population, by some estimates, had already been wiped out. Note 2 is Turkmenistan. For a country whose closest living relative is probably North Korea, it is surprising how few people have heard of Turkmenistan. While it may be a crazy nation, it hasn't always been this way. Unlike some of the countries on this list, Turkmenistan's history is ancient and goes back over 1,000 years, yet the 20-odd years since independence from the Soviet Union have probably been more eventful than all of the rest put together. Under Soviet rule, Turkmenistan was very much the quintessential Central Asian republic, underfunded, exploited, and oppressed by the government in Moscow, and mainly left out from the liberalization and development that happened during the USSR's later years. After the Great Split in 1991, though, Turkmenistan chose to follow quite a different path from its brethren. While it may today bear the hallmarks of an ex-Soviet state, namely corruption, nepotism at its finest, and inefficient government, none of the other Central Asian states have achieved this in quite the same way Turkmenistan has. No. 3 is Guinea-Bissau. If one thing can be said about former Portuguese colonies, it's that they have a rather worrying tendency to fall into the clutches of civil war. Guinea-Bissau is no exception to this rule. Following in the footsteps of Angola, Mozambique, and East Timor, this Lusophone nation has also been ravaged by conflict. There is one difference, though, between Guinea-Bissau and the others: the country's most stable years were paradoxically those immediately after independence. 9. It was also unique in that it managed to obtain independence before being given it peacefully by Portugal. No. 4 is Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is a unique country in many ways. It is, for example, the only Spanish-speaking nation in Africa, as a former colony of Spain. It is also the only state on the continent to have a capital not on its mainland but rather on a tiny island several hundred miles offshore. No, really, somewhat less adorably, it also has the longest-serving leader in Africa, Teodoro Obiang, the epitome of a despotic strongman, whose rule has lasted almost 40 years. No. 5 is East Timor. East Timor is one of the world's most decidedly unlucky countries. First exploited and colonized by Portugal, the islanders fought valiantly for their independence and were finally granted it in 1975 after the Portuguese Revolution. It was very much a case of jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, though, for as soon as independence was declared, neighboring Indonesia took advantage of the internal strife and disorder within the new country to invade it and declare it part of their own territory. No. 6 is Central African Republic. The Central African Republic's name is a bit of a misnomer. It is central, and it is indeed African, but the CAR at the moment is less of a republic and more of a failed state. As with Somalia, the government controls little of the country outside of the capital, and much of the nation is run by various rebel groups. The CAR has also, much like Somalia, been in a state of quasi-perpetual civil war for over a decade. The country's problems, though, date back quite a bit further than the start of civil war. The first democratic leader of Dakar only lasted a few years before dying in a suspicious plane crash. No. 7 is Brunei. Brunei is known by some as the shell-fare state, and with good reason. This small, petroleum-rich Asian nation has been effectively bankrolled by the oil companies that operate within it. Brunei's authoritarian leader, Sultan Bolkiah, was once one of the world's richest men, but this wealth hasn't come at the expense of his people, or at least, not too much. Bruneian citizens receive subsidies on everything from petrol to oil, and despite the fact that the Sultan spends millions of the public budget on his collection of luxury cars, Brunei has one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world. No. 8 is Mali. Mali is a beautiful and idyllic African country, filled to the brim with natural resources and fragmented along religious and ethnic lines. If there ever was a prime candidate to become a failed state, it would be Mali. It is no surprise then, perhaps, that half a century on from independence, this nation has not been as successful as some had hoped. No. 9 is the Comoros. The Comoros may be an island nation that almost nobody's ever heard of, but so far, that hasn't stopped it from breaking a number of rather impressive records. The archipelago is one of the most revolution-prone countries in Africa, and indeed the world, with a grand total of 21 throughout its history, a fact that's even more impressive when you consider that it's only actually existed for 42 years. 3 problems started from the very outset of independence, when it turned out that one of the islands claimed by the Comoros didn't actually want to join up with them and preferred being ruled by France instead. Since then, the Comoros has experienced a number of rather unique events, such as a Maoist revolution, a president shot dead in his bed by an anti-tank missile, and dictatorships backed by foreign mercenaries. No. 10 is the Gambia. The fact that the first Gambian president was re-elected 5 times and the second ruled for over 2 decades, for a total of 53 years between them, should tell us volumes about the politics and history of this country. Jawara, the country's first leader, took up his post, initially as prime minister, in 1962, just before Gambian independence from the UK. Jawara was, by all accounts, somewhat better than other African leaders of the era. Corruption in the Gambia was less prevalent than in other neighboring countries. The majority of senior governmental figures led relatively modest lives, at least compared to, say, Gaddafi, and he ostensibly adhered to democratic values. The original Gambian state was not single-party, nor was it authoritarian, and the media was even, quite, free.